Hey everyone, I just wanted to give a quick introduction to the recording of our virtual meetup that we had today. A huge thank you to Sentinel One and Stealthbits, our two sponsors. We couldn't have done it without you, and we really appreciate your efforts. This was an amazing event with lots of great conversation, and so I hope you enjoy it. Please like, share, give us some feedback, and subscribe to our channel.
All right, so it's, our absolute pleasure to be able to talk to you all this afternoon and really just, give you some insight into, some of the things that we've seen really in the privileged access and privileged account management space over multiple years. To give you an idea of who I am, I've been around for quite a while, as Alexia said. Even though I'm only 25, I've been in this space for 30 years. So I've had my own company. I had a company that I sold to Novell. It was a privilege management company 10, 15 years ago. I've worked for Symantec, Novell, Quest, Dell. I mean, who in this industry hasn't worked for Quest at some point? And really, lived and breathed this stuff, on the front line. And that's part of why I like these sorts of events, because in a way, it's not about, selling a product, which of course, that's our daytime jobs. But the other side of it is the fact that, we want to do a better job. We see a lot of things that are wrong out in the fields, just over a number of different years, whether it's different practices, different nuances, in different geographies, different verticals have different challenges. And sometimes when you find better ways of doing things, you want to tell people about it. So I'm very passionate about this stuff. I don't go to bed reading PAM books or anything, but I do like to make sure that people are aware of what we're doing. So very, very topical. Let's think about, today's environment. So, good old COVID-19, or not, as the case may be, has really sort of forced a lot of challenges on the way that we work today. We're used to our traditional security boundaries, either be, within our offices, corporate environments, and now all of a sudden, we're sort of thrust into these home working situations. It was interesting, actually. I did a call with a partner yesterday, and one of the guys was actually sat on a bed. He had a headboard behind him, and he said, my wife got the desk first. And that's some of the challenges that we have. That we're all in these remote situations. We've all got kids. I got my daughter, trying to sort of do her flute lessons, up in the kitchen upstairs as I'm on conference calls. Lots of different challenges. But the biggest, issue is the fact that we're now all of a sudden having to access the stuff that we would normally be connected to on the network remotely. If we take a look at, some of the issues, relating just to VPNs, without, proper controls, what a lot of organizations have done is really take this, almost like a last minute approach, to be able to go out and open up access to resources they would typically have accessed over the VPN. The big problem is the fact that you're really only as protected as your endpoint, because if your endpoint becomes compromised in whatever way, potentially your systems are. And it's not even just thinking of malware. Think of, Bob the admin. He sat on his kitchen table, not sat on his kitchen table, but sat at his kitchen table. He's doing his work. One of the kids needs something. He steps out of the room. Another family member, maybe a little bit nefarious, says, okay, what has gone on here? And, starts poking around in the system. What you're doing is by, adding all these different endpoints, especially over, VPNs and the like, is really adding more sort of egress points, into that environment. Is there, I don't know whether there's there's a bit of background noise going on the Zoom.
Yeah, I feel like there is as well. If you're not talking, can you please mute yourself?
I don't know whether it's one of the bees in the background of my hive, but it's there we go. That's a bit better.
I think we got it.
Awesome. All right. So, ultimately, when we look at the types of damage that people can do, it generally starts at one system. And that's, here's a really sort of the key thing. When we start looking at just about every high profile attack, which, let's face it, I mean, it's gone quiet recently, but generally every couple of months, there's someone else, that's been compromised. It's really always involved accounts of privilege, in order to be able to traverse around, because ultimately, without any privileged accounts, you really can't move around anywhere. You can't get from A to B. So when we start looking at anatomies of lateral movement attacks with that one compromised system, generally the first thing, is when we then start looking at, what an attacker would do. Number one is they dump the LSAS. They look to see, okay, what hashes do I have available? Now, the big challenge there is if you have your administrative accounts on multiple hosts using the same set of credentials, now you're really opening up the door for people to be able to access those other hosts. So now all of a sudden, instead of actually having one compromised system, you might have 10, you might have 100 different compromised systems, because people are obviously able to get onto those boxes. Now, once people have access to those systems, this is really where it gets interesting, because we've got a lot of privileged accounts in our environments. Not just the built-in accounts like administrator and root, but domain accounts. So, typically these would be like the -A's, -admins, whatever prefix, suffix, you happen to add to it. And, generally you will multiply that by the number of administrators you have, multiply that by the number of domains, and then even multiply that potentially by the number of roles that you have. It's certainly not unusual to see thousands, if not tens of thousands, of these accounts in any given environment. So what happens is, really
Now, when you
by,
say tens of thousands,
yep,
like, are you talking individual admin accounts? Because that would be
-A
like
accounts.
10,000 admin accounts would be a lot, wouldn't it?
No, I mean, so let's say, for example, I've got 1,000 admins, so if I have 1,000 admins, then, you know, 10 accounts each. I mean, that's 10,000 accounts. So these aren't really 10,000 admins, these are 10,000 accounts which are in the environment that are dedicated to that user, but
Okay.
aren't necessarily shared.
Okay.
And that's really the distinction. So, when we look at like the pass a hash attack, that's using a shared account. I mean, that's typically something like administrator, root, whatever, something that doesn't belong to an individual. These domain accounts, these are dedicated accounts. Now, part of the challenge is obviously, it provides an attack surface. There's never generally an easy route from A to B. So what will happen is, from a compromised system, a user or an attacker will move from system to system to system. Again, there's not rocket science. This is just classic lateral movement. So, when we start looking at where the challenges are, we really need to shift focus in terms of the things that we should be locking down. The attack surface aren't really the endpoints. The attack surface are the accounts themselves, the identities that allow people to be able to traverse around. Because ultimately, if you remove any of those attack surfaces, it's like removing the oxygen from a fire. You can't really move anywhere else.
Yeah,
So the
that's
kind of
definitely a different perspective on it. That's interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, as to say, it's more compounded now, because we have these multiple points of egress. When you start looking, or ingress, I should say, into an organization through VPNs, and the fact that we're now extending our boundaries out, to really a lot of places that are uncontrolled. So ultimately, VPNs only secure as that remote system. The audit trail very often is missing in these types of things, where someone's logging on, obviously using common administrator credentials or not using some form of delegation to access the endpoints can really open yourself up to those pass a hash attacks. And then when we start looking at, just the ability to be able to leverage ticket artifacts, to domain administrative accounts, those are the things, that actually then provide that lateral movement. So let's look at a few of approaches, where we can lock this down and really try to see if we can prevent. So, when we look at proxies, if we add proxies, that adds instantly, a point where a user doesn't have direct access to the resource. Now, generally you have an access policy. You also generally have the ability to be able to record what's happening through proxies. There's also mechanisms to allow you to be able to obfuscate or hide the password. So in other words, the user accesses a proxy and the proxy connects them to the endpoint using a different set of credentials. So, in that sense, the user has never been exposed directly to the credentials on that endpoint. When we start looking at what we're able to do on the endpoints themselves, as people are using hashes, and the ability to be able to move around from system to system, making sure that accounts are regularly rotated on these endpoints and have different credentials, again, is an absolute critical thing, as well as even drastically getting rid of those privileged accounts. Now, this might seem a bit of an odd thing because, when I say to customers, look, you need to get rid of your privileged accounts, they just look at me blankly and say, well, right, well, how are we supposed to work then? And, there are ways. So what we have is, there are some methodologies which I'm going to talk about. But we all tend to think that existing PAM solutions are really the way forward, and we, over the last 18 years, PAM has evolved, but it doesn't necessarily remove a lot of the challenges that we've been seeing. So if we go back 18 years to what I call the big bang of PAM, I mean, this is really where sort of vaulting, first started. At that point, if you consider the environment that we were in at the time, this is post-Enron. You had executives going to jail. People were looking for ways in which they could meet compliance objectives. They needed the ability to be able to say, yeah, we're doing our due diligence, we're doing our rotation, whatever compliance angle it was, whatever vertical you're on, they needed to be able to do the right thing. Now, the low-hanging fruit at that point was those built-in accounts, the shared accounts. This actually used to be called shared account password management. I mean, I think SAPM, was one of the early terms that I think Burton at the time actually came up with. But it was all around rotating things like administrator root, maybe sys, an Oracle SA, on the SQL Server, but essentially meaning that you had some sort of control, over the accounts. Now, over time, this has evolved, so say we've gone into this, okay, where we're vaulting, and I always count the vaulting as generation one. That's the first decade of the millennium, to this new decade, which is we've just come out of, which was really the decade of access management, the decade of the proxy. Because, at the time, I mean, I used to run a solution architecture team at Quest, installing this type of products. And that's, when I started to see really proxies, becoming pretty well in every deal. I mean, they've been around a few years before. Proxies have been around since, let's say, 2008, 2009, some of the early ones. But it was really a replacement for Bastion hosts. If you think about it, before then, that was a way that people traverse network segregation. You stuck a host in that subnet, you locked your user onto a host, and then from there, they then jumped off to whatever they needed to go. Now, as I say, proxies fulfilled a great task, because at that point, it meant that you could log the user onto the endpoint, you could get around that segregation, record what they're doing, but at the same time, not expose them to the credentials. That's really where the vault tie-in comes, because what we were able to do at that point is play in those credentials automatically. Now, here's really when things started to get messy, and get messy in a good way, but also in a bad way. So Microsoft, really said, they started pushing, said, look, we need to have these better best practices over separation of duty. You need more than one account. You shouldn't be logging in as administrator, and they're absolutely right. So, their approach is you have your productivity account, which gives you the rights to be able to access your desktop, your email. It's basically doesn't have any privileges, and then you have a separate administrative account that allows you to be able to get to where you need to go. Again, dedicated to the user. So not a shared account, but an individual account per user, generally, as I say, per role on multiple different domains. Now, for many years, and certainly when I was, in the practice of selling these types of solutions, we were encouraging customers, to put everything in vaults. I mean, that's really what we knew. That's what PAM was. Inadvertently, what we've been doing is really just creating an attack surface. And the interesting thing is when we start looking at all of the different accounts that people have, those are the accounts that get exploited. Um, what vaults do is you're probably aware, they allow you to be able to manage credentials. They rotate credentials. So what they do is they stop the good guys from getting more access they need. So when Bob, the admin, has finished doing what he's doing, the vault will rotate the credential. It'll kick him out of the proxy. He no longer has access. Now, think of, various attacker, that's come in through whatever route. They've got in, they got access, they own a system. They're not interested in passwords. What they're going to do is they're going to look around for artifacts. So, the vault doesn't stop a person from compromising an account. They're going to compromise the account in any case if there's an artifact lying around. So if there are accounts in your organization with privilege, now you actually have given them really a vehicle to move around. They can move around from system to system. So in some respects, and it's kind of ironic, that we've been trying to sort of, promote this thing where we are protecting users. But at the same time, we've actually been making the situation slightly worse because people have been almost been encouraged to add more and more accounts, which could be exploited.
Well, that
So,
leads into a dilemma that we have at work, especially with some vendors. We're starting to see more and more vendors saying, okay, we have an offshore team or an external team of like 10 people. We want to be able to access different systems. Just give us one shared account that we can share between those 5 users because they don't want to have to deal with all those different account levels. Then throw in the fact that you're going to try and put in password rotation policies, whether it's 60 days or 90 days or 180 days. And now you're getting pressure from the vendor side to make it simpler for them, even though it's not bad security. Now you're getting pressured from the internal system, your internal users, because they're like, hey, I have to do X, Y, and Z to get these passwords rotated in the time frame that security is mandating. So I could see where this is slowly making that problem bigger.
well, and you actually raise a really good point because I always remember when I was at Symantec, we used to have this little sliding scale, which we say it's a balance between security and availability. If you want something to be totally secure, you pull out the power plug and you stick it in a locked room. If you want it to be completely available, you have no security. And I think sometimes what we forget is that, companies need to operate. If you were in the business of making toasters, you're not worried about security. You're worried about making toasters and all of the support systems, operational technology, production lines, whatever it happens to be, to make those toasters. So, really, I think what's happened over the years is security has almost become, I want to say, a scapegoat, but we've tried to put too much focus on the wrong side of security and saying, look, you need more and more of these accounts, which really does nothing to actually protect you. And if anything, it makes it more complicated because the more accounts you have, the more you have to manage them. People think PAM is complicated. And it's funny, actually, I have this conversation almost every day with different people that say, yeah, I hate PAM. It's just so complicated. PAM isn't complicated. You're just getting users from A to B. Bob, the admin, needs to log on and do some stuff on his server. That's all PAM is. You're facilitating the ability to log on there safely, securely, audited, and obviously protecting everyone in the process. So I think what we've done is we've really done a very bad job of doing that. Now, when we start to look at some best practices, first of all, I like to do what I call untangling the PAM. So separating out privilege access management and privilege account management. Privilege account management is simply the process of rotating built-in accounts, or service accounts. Anything that is a shared account that doesn't belong to a carbon-based line form. So it's something that you need to rotate. You got that due diligence. You've got to have some process in place, but the focus really is around the things that we need to do day to day. Those accounts that get you from A to B. These are all of the dedicated accounts, or sometimes what we call namesake accounts. So I'm saying, that it's quite easy to actually build up multiple accounts. I spoke to a customer a couple of months ago, and each of their admins had at least 50 accounts. And these things happen. I mean, they had a vault, and they thought that they were being protected. They thought, well, I got a vault. It's a place to store my account. So it's okay to have more accounts, isn't it? Because the vault keeps them protected, without realizing that, the more accounts you're adding into that environment, the larger the attack surface that you're giving that could potentially be exploited. So really the best approach is to remove the accounts. Now, there's a couple of ways of doing it. One is, very simply to be able to say, once the account has been finished with, you remove the privileges. So it's sometimes something called like a just-in-time approach. So you add the privileges when it's needed, you remove them when it's not, and leave the account in a disabled state. But then the other thing is an ephemeral account. Which is interesting actually, because it took me a while to actually learn how to spell it and even to actually pronounce it. But now I can do both. I actually, I have to ephemeralize everything. It's a great word. Now, the best way to think of ephemeral accounts and the way that, the impact they have is to use what I call my taxi analogy, or rideshare, whatever you want to do. When we think about the way that we deal with getting from A to B in the real world in taxis, we don't keep a taxi in our garage. I mean, it would be senseless if we don't even keep a driver standing by. You order one, you tell it where you want to go, you get to that destination, and the next time you get a new one. But what we've done is, because we've been so conditioned with the fact that we have to vault everything in our environment, we've got into this almost like this mentality that we have to vault our dedicated accounts. Those are taxis. As soon as you are vaulting an account, it's like keeping a taxi in your garage, because as soon as you then start vaulting that account, now it's a liability. You have to rotate the credential. You've got to do your due diligence.
Okay.
It's an overhead.
Mm-hmm.
It's a liability in your vault, and it's also an attack surface in your environment. Now, the reason why we have to rotate and keep the shared accounts in vaults is because you can't disable them, you can't delete them when they're finished, because they're built in. Other things need to use them. But if you have accounts which are belonging to individual users, it makes absolutely no sense to store it anywhere, because I'm the only person that's using it. If I'm not using it, no one else needs to use it. So why on earth am I storing it somewhere? You see, so that's where I think really, the privilege account management and privilege access management has become blurred over the years. And, the best practice really is to separate these out, into two different things.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it, because looking at your shared accounts, or your more and more service accounts are getting created, right? We're going to a remote economy. We're going to more APIs, more automation. Like, I see what you're saying about those being more static accounts, right? But yet you or me or Matt, we're going to be logging on and off, where the APIs could be literally running real time 24/7.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. But here's the thing. I mean, even when an API needs an account, there's no reason why you couldn't provision an account when the API needs it, and then, release it when it's done. Now, obviously, if it's, if something's permanently running, absolutely, I mean, you keep it there, with its permanent privileges. But there's always room, where, when things are at rest, we don't need to do them. And again, think of how we deal with society at the moment. We live in, a streaming age. We live in a just-in-time age. We don't buy DVDs, Blu-rays or whatever anymore. We stream them as and when we want them. We rent things. Ride shares. We get to where we need to go using technology, using something else. We don't have to store it, because now we don't have to worry about all of the, the overhead that goes around storing something. But it's the same thing with access management. To me, that's a vehicle, and so as we're moving into this new decade, this is something that I'm very heavily promoting, the fact that, we got to stop keeping these, accounts in our garage, if you like. I mean, we need to start moving these into transient things where, you get an account, you give it permissions, give it a password, lock somebody in, get them to where they need to go, and then afterwards remove the account again. Again, it just removes the overhead. Now, when you think of the sort
Hey,
of different
Martin.
elements, yeah.
I just wanted to take a second. If anyone, again, if you want to jump in the conversation, if you have questions, please do so. There's almost 100 people on this call, so I'm sure there's some questions bouncing around in some people's heads. Don't feel like you can't. Just stay muted if you're not talking, but please feel free. This is for you. So here's a chance to ask questions if you have them, or comments, ideas, thoughts, and be a part of it.
And even if you make even the slightest noise when you're unmuted, your little window pops up. So I'm kind of looking at that, and I'll make sure I pause. So
yeah, Martin, I had a question if I could. So
yeah.
many of the clients that I work with get stuck in this tendency of keeping things forever just in case. Nobody really knows if we're going to need it again, so let's put it over here. We'll try and store it and protect it and keep it forever. What do you see as the key argument to getting around that sort of philosophy or mindset within companies, getting them comfortable with it's okay to go to a more temporary solution? You don't have to keep these forever. How do you sort of progress them down that line?
That's a great question. And that's actually part of, really creating, a comfort blanket of deployment. Because, I mean, when we look at traditional PAM and the way that we use them with vaults, they're very invasive. So if you replace one solution with another, it's not like something you can put in a piecemeal way. You just rip the old vault out, you put the new one in, it now becomes the authoritative source for all of those accounts. If something goes wrong, it's very, difficult to actually unravel yourself from that. So there's definitely an education involved with this. People almost have to unravel what they know about PAM and think about it differently. And that's really why when I talk about the subject, there's a lot of preamble, we're talking about the history of PAM, but I think it's important for people to understand how we got to where we are. The reason why we put things in vaults was because that's all we had to start off with. It was a simple use case about shared accounts. But as time has moved on and methodologies have changed, we're not necessarily using shared accounts for day-to-day access. We don't have to leverage those same tool sets in order to be able to do what we used to do. There are different ways in which we can do it that actually provide a lot of benefits on multiple levels, whether it's reducing the attack surface, reducing the overheads, and also simplifying the process. Because like I say, if you look at any PAM implementation and you look at that number of accounts, you think of all the different roles, all the overlapping resultant set of policies you have. It's, you have to do access certification. That's a big overhead every time you need to audit to figure out who is mapped to what account, who should belong to each account, as well as having a system to deal with that volume. So no, I appreciate the question. Now, when we look at this, the ways in which these types of things work well is really just by breaking things down to their component parts. As I said, PAM is complex because it's evolved over time with lots and lots of different use cases. So I had a product, again, one of the big three products in the space. And like all the other vendors, we're all watching what each other were doing. So every time another vendor added something, I would add it. Every time I added something, the other vendors would add it. Because you're in this RFP catch-up. Every time an RFP goes out to the customer, you never want to say no. So, you want to do your due diligence and you add a little line item for every single thing that comes out. But unfortunately, what happens is you end up with these solutions that are all built around edge cases. And as I say, when you get back to PAM, it really is as simple as these three elements. You've got people, you've got Bob the admin. You have the things that he needs to do and the places where he needs to do it. That's really all it boils down to. Now, these can be very broad things, like Bob needs domain admin access to his tier 0 environment, or it might be, okay, I need to log him on to change a password, but it doesn't matter. It's still, here's a person, here's what they need to do, and here's where they need to do it. Now, these, types of methodologies can, really be, that they're starting to sort of resonate, not just with the people that we're talking to, but also the analysts. So I regularly talk to all of them, Forrester, Coventry Cole, IDC, Gartner, and, even Gartner actually did a report back in September saying that really this type of just-in-time methodology is the way forward. I mean, when we start looking at this new decade that we're going into, PAM doesn't have to be the old way. There are new ways of doing it that can actually reduce down what they call zero standing privileges, or increase zero standing privileges. Get rid of all of those privileges that are normally hanging around when the accounts aren't being used. Now, again, this is, it is part of a mindset, but it's interesting, every time, when I talk to people about this, normally the penny drop moment is actually when they start thinking about taxis, which is why I really put that in there so people get the visualization, because then they get it. And it's like, wow, yeah, I mean, it seems silly. Why do I keep a taxi, in my house? And that's kind of what I'm doing with my privileged accounts. So, the other benefit is when we start looking at auditing, because as I mentioned, I mean, one of the big problems with PAM at the moment are volumes of scale, because it's many to many to many. You think of all of the different accounts you've got in every system, think at all of the administrators, multiplied by the number of domains, multiplied by the number of roles, even multiplied by the number of applications. You have to figure out how you're going to map one person to another. Now, in the traditional world, if you like, in the old school where we were vaulting these accounts, normally you've got your upstream identity management tools, you've got your SailPoint, Savient tools, provisioning these privileged accounts, which are generally made up of, roles and entitlements in the roles. And then you've got a downstream PAM solution, which is mapping administrators to those accounts using group-based ACLs, and then feeding that information back up to do attestation certification. Now, when you look at this type of approach, the accounts just don't exist at all. And actually, I always, at this point, have to sort of use my Doctor Who analogy, kind of the new Doctor Who, weeping angels, where, they've, if you blink, you can get killed. But with this, the accounts don't exist until someone is doing something. The moment somebody stops doing that job, the moment they, kind of finish what they're doing, you have no more use of that account. So what you have is accounts that exist in moments of time. So then, there are different methodologies in order to be able to map users to be able to do that access certification, because now what you're doing is you're doing entitlements based upon the things that they want to do that will then create the account, as opposed to the account itself, if that makes sense. So again,
do you see, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I didn't want to lose the thought. Do you see a reduction in logging because of this?
so it depends on the type of login. I mean, really, there's probably the same amount of login, because transactionally, the user's still logging onto the same number of places. You're recording, the same sort of activity that they're doing. But what you're doing is you're really, it's more reducing the overhead. So the login, I would say, is the same. But then it's really taking the process away, because say the more accounts you have, the more you have to manage, because, they're, even if you take away that attack surface issue, they're something that has to be managed in the organization. People have to map people in roles to those particular accounts. So remove the accounts, you remove the problem.
So question
Yeah.
that I have, it sounds like a lot of this relies upon auto provisioning with for this just-in-time access. And in addition to that, the question that I have is, when you look at these logs then from a SIM perspective, you're going to see all of these auto provisioned accounts. And then they have to be tied back to the user to which they did it. So does it end up being the same account name over and over again? Does it end up being a random account name? And then how do you tie that back in a SIM situation so you know that in fact this user is the person that made this change, and as a corollary, here's all the other changes that they made?
Yep, love it. That is a perfect question.
Good question.
Yeah, and the answer is actually all of the above. So, you can do all of those. So you can create ephemeral accounts that have a persistent name. There's certain things you have to do. I mean, those solutions have to make sure that they clear the SIG cache on, the computers that they're logging into, because otherwise you're going to get an account with the same name in a different SID. You have to be able to make sure you properly remove the profiles on those endpoints. But absolutely, you can keep a persistent name. But another approach is also to incorporate part of the user's name in with that random account. If you look at a SAM account name, you can have up to 20 characters. So, you know, even if you keep, you know, sort of 15 characters or up to 15 characters to incorporate that user SAM account name. And obviously, you know, the domain because it's on that particular domain, and, you know, some sort of randomness, you know, to make it unique. There are ways of tying it back. And there's also ways of doing it, again, you know, through APIs. You know, so for example, if you know, you can have a Splunk app, for example, you know, that may be doing dynamic lookups of those accounts with the PAM solution to be able to say, all right, okay, this actually relates to this real carbon-based life form, you know, so you've got that, you know, correlation at the same time.
Quick question. So I'm understanding the portion of it where when it comes to access of systems or services, but I guess I'm still a little vague of how it relates to file access, or does it still do file access? I guess does it take whoever the user is and map it to a I guess a constant account
Yeah.
for file access?
So how these things work, this is where, you know, the activities are important, because what you're doing is you are applying permissions. Now, if you think of a domain account, you know, obviously an account gets created as a member of domain users, and you have different ACLs, you know, that you can add them to, whether that's something very broad, like, you know, I'm going to give this user, I'm going to make, you know, this temporary account a member of a domain admin group, for example, you know, for 2 hours, you know, for somebody to be able to work. But you can also apply, using these types of techniques, very specific permissions. So to your point, let's say, for example, I wanted someone to be able to go in like an administrator to modify share permissions. Using things like PowerShell and the SMB commandlets, it's very easy to actually have something that will give access rights to modify commandlets to, you know, this generated account that then get removed along, you know, when that account gets removed afterwards. So it's really down to the granularity of the activity themselves and how you want to set it up. Now, the flip side is sometimes, you know, it's sometimes very tempting to become almost over granular when it looks at security and think, you know, people think, yeah, I need to lock it all down. But now you're into another overhead again of having to manage that. So, you know, I think it's actually what a big insurance company once told me when I was looking down, you know, trying to put in some technology years ago to lock down the DBAs, you know, and the guy said, look, I pay my DBAs a lot of money. You know, they're all background checks. You know, there's a limit to how much I want to control them down. Yeah, I want to, you know, give them a sys role or whatever in order to be able to log in, modify database structures and go in, but I don't need to nursemaid them. So to your point, I mean, you know, a solution has to be granular enough to go down to that level to add certain permissions as and when required if they're not generally available within a group. But then at the same time, sometimes it is better to go a little bit higher level on those permissions if you're going to be removing them and it's going to be temporal access.
Yeah, that's where I was going with it. So, you know, as an example, you know, let's say you have somebody from HR that has to have access to only, you know, sensitive data, that they have to have access to it, you know, on daily basis. You're not going to be going in and changing that constantly. That's going to be an access that they're going to get, you know, on permanent basis.
Yep.
As long as they're identified as somebody from HR, they're going to have to get that access, you know, every day, every time they log into the system. So I guess where I'm going with it is, is it easy to set up that access, you know, as long as the person is defined and you know, I guess is identified and mapped. I guess I don't know how it would be mapped to Active Directory, or what would be the mechanism that this person, let's say, would be mapped, you know, to allow this person to have access on file basis. I guess I'm understanding the portion of allowing a person access to systems and services a little bit easier and better versus file access, because that seems to be more of a, I don't know, constant access, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, and that's the thing. I mean, sometimes, I mean, this is a tool, a tool in the arsenal. I mean, PAM isn't a one size fits all, for any mechanism, as we said, like for certain things like service accounts, certain sorts of, file access, A to A. Very often you need persistence, but it's all around mitigation. It's around limiting the threat. With PAM, as you know, I mean, I used to work in the antivirus space when I was at Symantec, and we used to say, you build a wall, somebody builds a ladder, you build a bigger wall, they build a bigger ladder. It's just you never get rid of it. I mean, it's due diligence. It's mitigation of a threat. You put in whatever controls you have. You make sure you've got login in to identify anomalies if you don't have hard and fast controls. And, again, you sometimes things are going to slip through. I mean, it's the nature of a beast. We're living in a very fluid society. But, when we look at this type of methodology, it's about really, mitigating that threat, for the majority of use cases. There's always going to be edge cases, where you may need to have something there. But again, really good point, but to say, I would always advocate doing things more on a group base rather than making things too granular. Now, let's look at some of the issues that we have, where people have PAM solutions. As I mentioned, I mean, very often it's very difficult for people to get from A to B. And the expression I always use, is like, do you own your PAM or does the PAM own you? Because I actually spoke to, actually it was one of the largest banks in the world, the CISO, when I was at RSA. And, what he said is, what, we've actually had our PAM solution in there for 15 years. It's been there since day one. The problem is it's so entrenched into all of our systems. Our APIs are built around it, our workflow. We got all of these in-house systems that have been built, for provisioning user accounts, our identity management. I just can't even see a way how we could remove it. And so I think that's another challenge to consider as well is, very often you've got to get solutions that will play nicely with other products. The traditional PAM approach has been ripped from place, where you're saying, okay, whatever you got, I'm going to take it out. I'm going to give you something with equal functionality. And this is where I think
the business
separation
groans.
Well, exactly. That's absolutely right. And that's the thing. So that's the separation between, access management and account management. The account management is a bit that's difficult because that's a bit that's ingrained in. The access management, when you change it to ephemeral, you're really not affecting anything because all you're doing is creating a new account on top. You're not affecting any existing one. You can just take your existing accounts, disable them temporarily, and move to ephemeral. If it doesn't work, okay, well, you just move back to his other account. So I think that's another thing to consider as well is, I mean, as much as though it amazes me how many people don't have a PAM solution, even in this day and age, even large companies, a lot of companies that do have PAM solutions find it very, very difficult, to move from A to B. So, this is kind of like my little summaries.
Just a quick time check. We have about 5-ish more minutes.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to say, this is my summary slide.
Perfect timing.
So
whatever slide Martin was going to have up, he would say is the summary slide. But
yeah, I know, exactly. That's right. Yeah. Click. This is my summary slide. All right. So when we look at the, like a summary of all of this stuff, when we put it together, it's about due diligence. Now, to the question earlier, about, how granular do we go with this stuff? There's low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit for any organization is your domain admins. So many, AD owners that I've talked to say, I've got hundreds of people in my domain admin group. I don't know half of these people are. I don't want to remove them because I don't want to break anything, but at the same time, I'm responsible for the solution, and all the, everyone's got the keys to the kingdom. So, I think that's the key thing is look for the low hanging fruit. It doesn't have to be a big bang, where you put everything in or put an entire PAM solution. Look for ways in which you can reduce these attack surfaces. You need to have methodologies that allow you to be able to have more than one account, but without the overhead. So that's where the nice thing about ephemeral accounts, because you can create them on the fly and then remove them. So it's kind of like having your cake and eat it. You can have your dual account, you can have your separation of duty, but you don't have the overhead of dealing with it. Again, it's not the taxi that you've got in your garage. It's always about making sure that you're adhering to this no standing privilege rule. So anywhere where you are looking at privileged accounts, make sure that you just don't have the accounts that are sitting around. I mean, because those are the accounts that get exploited. People aren't worried about hacking passwords. They will hack artifacts. So do whatever you can to remove those Kerberos tickets, from the memory space. Do whatever you can to remove the accounts that they could compromise with those tickets. And again, it's all mechanisms towards that due diligence. The other important thing, is just for the love of God, never log into systems as administrator or root. People still do it. Because it's the easy thing. They think, oh, I got to use administrator because otherwise my terminal services won't work. I can't log on. You know what? There's this group called remote desktop users that you could also add users to. So again, it's just best practice. You don't have to go in as administrator. Always delegate. Protect the local groups from manipulation. The last thing you want is for someone to legitimately get access to a system and then suddenly add themselves or their buddy into a group. So make sure that you got control there. Shadow privileges. I mean, this is huge. Think of tools like Bloodhound, where you can go out and analyze an environment and say, you know what, Bob can reset this non-admin user, who can reset this non-admin user, who can reset this admin user. So even though he doesn't have direct access to reset an admin user, there's a path that he could potentially take in order to be able to get domain admin privileges. So by limiting what people have access to, even something as innocuous as resetting passwords with a help desk, is looking for those types of attack surfaces. And then finally, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Get solutions to play with each other, because if you try to put in a one size fits all, okay, something goes horribly wrong, now you've lost everything. Diversify. That there isn't a better form of redundancy in terms of having out-of-band mechanisms. Now, guess what? This is kind of what we do, which is why obviously there's a very strong angle to this. But this isn't just about you selling product. Like I say, I've been in this space for a long time, worked in some of the largest PAM implementations in the world, and this is really, a lot of this is actually PAM PTSD. I mean, this is trying to actually make PAM easier, because it's just way too complex. So we do have a product called SP-PAM. It stands for Privilege Activity Manager. We don't, that's, the A in our PAM is different, specifically because, as we say, the first generation tools were account management, second generation were access management. What we're saying, the third generation is all around activities. It's around getting people from A to B. That's really all PAM is. Making it simple. Doesn't have to be complex. Auditing, recording, but always reducing everything down to this zero standing privilege. Reduce the attack surface and make it, far more easy to use. So that's it. That's everything. I've taken that up to the top of the hour.
Matt, did we want to set up maybe some time? Not today, but did you want to set up some time for people that have questions so we can get to the Q&A part separately?
Yeah, actually, I did have one that I think is a good question for Stealthbits, and that is from a pricing standpoint. Do you see the ability for, because we do have a lot of small organizations in our audience, is being able to do something like this cost prohibitive for smaller organizations that are also dealing with security issues?
So that is actually one of the best questions, because here's the thing. PAM has been out of the reach of many, many small organizations because it's complex and not just expensive, but it's difficult to install. You need professional services very often if you don't really understand how to implement it. So one of the key things that we've done with ours is we've just created a package which includes users. Everything's included. So, part of the approach I feel, is, that should happen is everything that you shouldn't be charging for every single thing. You shouldn't say, yeah, you want session management, yeah, you got to charge for that. You want access certification, you got to charge for that. It should be one package, one price, easy subscription model, make it affordable to users, but also make it easy to use. So that way you're not worried about, okay, now I also need SQL licenses, and now, I also need professional services. Make it easy for people to do business with you. That's ultimately, what my goal is.
Excellent.
Yeah. Alexia, we've been asked, what is your background, actually?
So this is s'mores bars. I can send out the recipe if anyone's interested. It's just golden grahams, chocolate chips, marshmallow, and Hershey's bars.
Nice.
It looks good.
Getting hungry now.
A lot of butter, obviously, but
That's a Wisconsin
yeah.
background you have. Must add butter.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Post that in our LinkedIn page.
I will.
So to everyone, before we move on to the next our panel discussion, we'll make sure that everyone has Alexia's contact information. For those of you that are maybe interested in seeing this or having deeper conversations, obviously they can assist with that. If you even have questions, again, make sure that you email or reach out to her. So we'll have that out there. Stealthbits, and Martin, everyone, I appreciate
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
Hopefully we didn't bore you a lot.
No, they were great questions.
Awesome topic. I think it's a super important space. I think this is a really, really fascinating approach that you guys are taking to fixing this issue. So again, much appreciated on all levels for you guys' support today.
Pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Absolutely. All right. So with that, we are going to jump right into the next portion of this, and that is going to be a panel discussion that's being headed up by Brian at Sentinel One. So, Mr. Schneebel, I don't know if you're out there. Hopefully,
I saw him earlier.
Yep.
Yeah.
No,
My little
I'm still
window
here.
of like 5 people keeps changing. So,
I was gonna say, can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yes.
yeah. Yep. Just fine.
I was gonna say what we might want to do is go ahead and have the videos closed off and just have Matt, you, Aaron, Brian, Jared, and Dan's videos on for everybody, but I'll leave that up to you. I was going to do a quick introduction on the Sentinel One side, but due to the limited time here, I'll try to keep this real short and sweet because I think we have a great group, a great panel, and I'll allow each person to introduce themselves. I'll take a second just to do my introduction of them. We have Dan Ayala, and I'll let you do your introduction. Founder of Socratic, former CISO of ProQuest, and he's also taken on a role in education right now. Brian McGinnis, principal and lead cybersecurity attorney from Barnes and Thornburg, and Dr. Jared DeMott from the west side of Michigan. And for those that don't know, also a Michigan State grad. Great to have you, as well as a huge background in cybersecurity. So from the Sentinel One side, we kind of wanted to change it up and bring together some great minds so that we could talk about the idea of security and privacy and why those become so important, and how those boundaries start to get a little bit blurred, and especially as we talk about some of the things that are going on today, in COVID-19 era, work from home in different organizations, talking about tracking of people. One thing I was going to do is I had like a few slides. I don't know that I'm going to jump into them, but I was going to tell a story of how EDR tells a story and how every device tells a story, right? And I'm just going to put one slide up there, if you guys don't mind. And this is the idea of how every device tells a story, right? And if you guys can see that and how that changes in an environment when you look at attack surfaces and some of them being low and slow, but how all the adversaries now are changing multi-techniques of automation, bulldozing through defenses. And this kind of goes to what Stealthbits was saying, and the ability to look at this and say, can you track each one of those stories and how they're all unique And can you put a process together? And this is where EDR becomes really powerful. And then can you use behavior to score all those and then track everything bad that's happening? And I'm running through this very fast. And then can you go back and do root cause to where that came from and ultimately mitigate those things, right? And I think from today's topic and what we're going to do from telling a story, not just a story about different attack surfaces, but different stories as it relates to privacy, different stories as it relates to the different verticals that we're in enterprises. And I don't know that we even need to throw a lot of questions at these guys, because bringing the different verticals together, I think we're going to have some great back and forth today. So with that being said, you know, thank you guys for giving us the time to come on. And I'll let you guys take it away.
Yeah, and then one thing, Brian, we also have Ralph Martino from Stealthbits, another name from my past as well, who will be happy to join in on the conversation as well. So, but with that, we'll let the panel kind of lead into what you guys are going to talk about.
So who wants to start?
Well, did you want to lead with, did you have the questions, Brian, or did you want to just have them do a quick introduction?
I'll have them do a quick introduction, and then I think we'll just put the first big question out there, which is kind of the topic of the day. But go ahead. I'll let Jared, you go first.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. So my name's Jared DeMott. I'm the founder and CEO of VDA Labs. We're a full scope cybersecurity company that has 4 main verticals. We focus on enterprise, so anything in the blue team, red team, compliance, forensic, incident response, you name it, to the what we call maker, so software development. AppSec as a service is an offering that we have, so helping anything from code review to code quality to developer training to fuzzing to any of the things associated in code security, apps, mobile, all kinds of different things. And then of course work in the federal, and then training. We teach a lot of classes on the various things that we do as well. So started my career almost 20 years ago at the NSA, and I've worked across the security industry in a lot of different verticals, from government to academic to startup business. And obviously this whole, yep, I hear somebody else coming through there. This whole shutdown situation's been interesting, but we've been doing well and still carrying on, taking care of folks throughout this whole process from a security standpoint. So thanks for having me on.
And Dan, I'll let you give an introduction quick.
Sure. I'm Dan Ayala. I'm the founder and managing partner of a company called Socratic. It's a virtual CISO and privacy as a service, privacy officer as a service company. I'm 25 years in information security, coming up through infrastructure, and I am currently also the interim CISO at Michigan State University. Although I do have a Bucky behind me, because that's my alma mater, and there is a Sparty on the shelf too. Excuse me. My background: I've been both chief privacy officer and chief information security officer, and both at the same time. So this, the topic today, the discussion, the juxtaposition of these two things, where security meets privacy, where society meets security and privacy, is really an interesting one.
So I think it's safe to say on Wisconsin and go green, both.
Yes.
Which is perfect for me.
And Brian, Brian McGinnis, I'll let you introduce.
Yeah, and I got to start with the Go Hoosiers. I'm down here in Indianapolis, so thanks everybody for having me, but keeping it in the Big Ten. My name is Brian McGinnis. Thanks for the intro earlier, Brian. I'm a partner with the law firm of Barnes & Thornburg, where I'm also one of the co-chairs of our data security and privacy practice group. I've also held a CIPP certification, Certified Information Privacy Professional, from the International Association of Privacy Professionals, IAPP. Those of you that are familiar on the privacy side know that well. I've held that for about 5 years, but my practice day to day is data privacy all day long these days. And so traditionally have practiced in technology-based law, a lot of internet law, a lot of tech companies, a lot of startups, those kinds of things. And increasingly my practice has been overtaken by the privacy work that we do. So a lot of that right now, I tend to separate it on sort of both sides of a breach. So we do a lot of breach investigations. breach response, notification letters, figuring out liability, back and forth with attorney generals and regulators and the like, but also do a lot of helping businesses set up data security and data privacy programs internally. And increasingly that is focusing on the privacy side as laws around the world are getting much more aggressive with what companies are required to do in addition to the security stuff that you guys do and have been so good at for so long. All these new laws about having more policies, procedures, and processes internally within organizations that are requiring companies to do a better job of providing notice, getting consents about collection and use of people's information. A really, obviously, sort of important and topical topic right now with what we're seeing and some of the changes that are being proposed there. So that makes up the bulk of my practice, helping companies address those issues and get their heads around what are these new privacy laws, what do they say, and okay, now how in the hell do we actually go about complying with these things?
Excellent. And then Ralph, do you want to give your introduction as well?
Sure, Ralph Martino. I'm Vice President of Product Strategy here at Stealthbits, where I'm responsible for running our DAG product line. Prior to that, I was a consultant where I ran data governance and protection programs for financial services and healthcare verticals. And prior to that, I worked in the financial services industry, putting together identity and data programs. So nice to meet everybody.
Excellent. Thank you. And then Mr. Schneebel, do you have the topics? Because I have too many windows open and I can't find them at the moment. So maybe you can prep the audience.
Yeah.
Those.
Yeah, there was a few different topics and we kind of blended them together. So one was the idea of right now you have a trade war, an oil price war, a global pandemic, elections, and an economic meltdown. And all this is kind of taking place at the same time, right? And how with such massive global events like that have changed the nature of cyber criminal underground and the nation state motives and tactics, what can organizations do to better prepare for these changes?
That was a mouthful, by the way.
The answer is yes.
My panel with that.
So yeah, there were some other questions too, I think, that you had kind of shared briefly with us in advance. One was related to ransomware and kind of talking about what people could do as that threat amps up too, right? As far as, what can people do to, in the face of changing strategies from ransomware where they maybe are going to throw out your data if you don't pay the ransom and things like that. And I think they kind of go hand in hand to an extent in the sense that, there's a lot of things changing in the world. Some things don't really affect cybersecurity so much in the sense that, some people work from home, remote. I mean, there's things that do change things. Some things maybe don't change things as much. The one thing we do know for sure is that as the world's increasingly more connected and increasingly more, prone to attack, there's possibility of better security and defenses as technology enhances. But if the connecting of everyone and everything is outpacing the security, we get into a problem. So long story short, the answer to the question of, how does this, whole pandemic and the oil trade and all this, and how does that tie into other things that are going on? I think it's more important than ever that organizations be proactively ready to face security threats. So things like, having all their logging in place, having thought through a disaster recovery plan, having thought through an incident response plan, having thought through what would it look like if your building was destroyed and then you had to send everybody home? Or what would it look like if your whole data center was ransomed and you had to, work from some other kind of backup? Or, conducting, obviously security testing throughout that whole process to make sure all that's working. And so anyway, I won't beat those to death because I feel like a lot of those are kind of, InfoSec 101 sorts of things that probably, I hope a lot of people on the call probably know something about already. But I think it's more important than ever to kind of continue to drive the basics home to businesses that if they haven't done backups or they haven't had a pen test or they don't have central logging or they don't have any intelligence about what they can see across their enterprise from a threat visibility standpoint, all those kind of things, the importance of that is only going to continue to rise as, personally, I don't think this is the only worldwide situation that we're going to face over the next 20 years. I think the volatility we see in the world is kind of amping up and ramping up. I fully expect to see other types of national and world disasters take place. I don't know what they'll be or when they'll hit. Nobody does. But I do think that there'll be more to come, unfortunately.
Just to play off that real quickly, I think that, you know, too many people as part of the organizations we serve see security as only the C part of the triad, and this is an opportunity to reinforce the I and the A, the integrity and the availability, not just confidentiality. I think those people associate those really closely, but the focus on backups, the focus on recovery, we've all had to execute some form of business continuity in this. Take that lessons learned and now run with it. What would we're going to have to phase back in. That's another type of business continuity, but bolster the areas in business continuity that are not there, in the integrity and the availability. That also plays to the ransomware. It plays to any kind of data corruption. And I think that as organizations, we haven't been focusing as much on those when we talk about security.
Now, I'm going to interject real quick. Daniel, do you think it's because a lot of people don't necessarily equate like having a business continuity or disaster recovery plan when it comes to the cloud? Like, you know, traditionally, you know, you brought up a good point, right? You're thinking about like, I caught fire or ransomware and all the physical stuff is taken care of. But do you think we're going to have a lot more issues with people not understanding they need a cloud exit strategy? And that could be double-fold, right? Like if Amazon should happen to go down, highly unlikely, but it still could happen. What are you going to do? Or if your SIM provider gets to be too expensive and you need to extract that data out of the cloud, do you think that a lot of companies just are thinking too physical and not enough virtual?
There's a couple of things there. One, never enter any technology that you don't know how you're going to exit. By the way, that's also the same for jobs. Know how you're going to leave a job on the day you arrive at it, or have an idea. But on the technology side, know how you're going to get out as you're going in. But similarly, the other thing is people are taking cloud. You mentioned cloud, and it raised the hairs on the back of my head only because people have mistaken redundancy for recovery. People aren't backing up cloud instances of things in the way that we would have on premise. And redundancy, you introduce ransomware into now you have highly available locked data and not a lot of way to recover it. So now you're almost actually forced toward the criminal activity, toward paying the ransoms in order to recover because you don't have a way to do it. And with increasing use of cloud, thinking about that, but it's really easy to have the discussion, oh, we've got it in 4 places in multiple AZs in multiple regions. But you can introduce something, either get locked out of it all or get introduced, get corruption introduced. Either it's integrity corrupt, like numbers get changed, or the whole thing goes kersplat. You still need to be able to recover. And then workplace recovery is the one I think we're all experiencing now as we're all sitting in our houses. Where are you going to put people? How can they do their jobs from wherever? And then meaningful discussion about, do people really need to come back? Can we now expand geographies that we're hiring people? There are security people all over the country, and if many companies stay in the mindset of, I will only hire people I can, that I can reach out and touch. But now we have new populations, including those that are disabled in some way or can't physically make it onto premises.
Ralph, do you have customers ask that stuff? I mean, Martin was talking about the lift and shift and ripping out. Are you seeing customers ask more poignant questions?
They're not really asking more poignant questions. They're really asking what to do next, and in some cases, what I've seen a lot of is priorities that shift.
Yeah,
we're in a big.
Hold on, just 1 second. We're getting some background noise from somebody.
T. Walsh, I think, is the background noise.
Trying to find there.
Okay.
Yeah, I think
go ahead.
that we didn't reduce or offset any of the risk. I think COVID increased it, and it's because it's volume and velocity and change, right? The volume at which the people went to working remote increased risk for the business. The volume at which I executed, or velocity at which I executed my 18-month cloud strategy went to 2 weeks. And that change and all that change I did created some fear. And I think that it's falling back on the people being ready, right? And preparing the people. Now we're into this new workforce. I think a few people mentioned it, reaching out and touching someone and the business continuity plans. When these people went remote, that reach out and touch something became a fear. So now that person that's sitting at home feels like they may have to respond to that email in 10 seconds. So they're not taking steps to maybe look at an email that they would in the office before they clicked on it. So I think that this philosophy, how you change, just increase this risk, and that's what they're really talking about. We're in an enablement phase. At some point, we got to shift back to that security compliance phase. You know, and I think it didn't impact like areas of HIPAA and stuff. It impacted things like consumer privacy and student privacy and things that aren't really vertically specific. You know, a lot of lawmakers now are stopped. They're focusing somewhere else. And so there's a slowdown in those privacy laws, you know, and I think that that's a benefit to any of the attackers, whether that be nation state or other. Right? We've introduced fear. We've quickly enabled without thinking about security. And I don't know when that phase rolls back. And so it's really trying to get them to realize this new way we're working has to be thought of differently, right? And how we get some of those security controls back into place. You know, you did the enablement, right? It was, I can't talk to you for 2 weeks. I got to get everybody working remote. We need to come back now and say, okay, we got them working now. How do we reduce that risk a little bit more?
Thank you. Brian McGinnis, are you seeing like your clients understanding that risk, both from a privacy point of view and a cybersecurity point of view, in the fact that they're moving so quickly? Are you getting reached out about that?
Yeah, so as a percentage, it's really low, right? So even before coronavirus, COVID, all this stuff hit, there's still at most organizations a real lack of a sort of meaningful privacy program. They're really good at the security technical side typically and have people who understand that. They get tools in place. But when you get into areas like understanding what personal information you have within your organization that's subject to a GDPR, subject to a California Consumer Privacy Act, who has access to that? Where does that live within the system? How are we protecting it? When you get into areas like vendor management, which is key right now, very few companies still have robust enough processes to be able to sign vendors in a way that's going to be compliant with these laws when there is sharing of PHI, PII, anything across those. And so something like the California law, anytime you've got an individual who is in California as part of your data set, whether it's employee, customer, consumer, otherwise, they are going to be subject to that law. And there are very new responsibilities on businesses to have particular provisions within the agreements that you're signing with them. And unless you are specifically trying to be compliant with CCPA, unless you're specifically trying to be compliant with the GDPR, you don't have those in your standard vendor contracts, and neither do they. And so in this rush to sign new vendors, everybody's trying to get new, providers set up to be able to work at home and the like. I see very few companies who have the internal processes that were already in place that would have allowed them to sort of work through that in a compliant way right now. So certainly there's going to be a lot of cleanup coming out on the back end of this thing, but frankly, it kind of existed already. What needs to happen is organizations need to do a much better job than they do currently of understanding what information is coming in, what they're doing with it while they have it, and then all these other third parties that are either getting access to it or physically being shared that data. There are new responsibilities that traditional IT, traditional security workflows wouldn't have touched on. And so that's just a massive gap that I'm seeing. So anybody who is trying to work towards compliance that doesn't have some process in place to take a look at, hey, we're doing some kind of a new vendor assessment, or we're going to hire a new vendor who doesn't have a privacy impact assessment as part of that, you're doing it wrong and you're not compliant from the get-go. And then everything else stems from there.
So what you're saying is we should all reach out to some venture capitalists and we should start vendor management as a service.
Yeah, that's certainly something you could do. I mean, there's a huge need for it. And I'll tell you, we work with, small startups and small tech companies. We work with some really big companies with some really sensitive, banking, health, government, secret kind of information. Pretty much across the board, unless you're a Facebook or a Google, companies aren't doing this at the level that they need to be consistent with these laws. And in terms of people not paying as much attention to the privacy laws, maybe you're right in terms of the focus of passage of new laws, but there's already a lot of these laws on the books. In particular, for example, the California Attorney General has come out and in the face of a lot of criticism where they're saying, hey, The law went into effect January 1st. The enforcement of this law is scheduled to go into effect July 1st. Everybody needs to not, or I guess the push of the industry was, we need to not go ahead with that law beginning enforcement July 1st, because people aren't going to be able to be ready for it. The Attorney General came out and said flatly, no, I'm not doing that. July 1st, it's still going to go into effect. So I think there is still going to be a focus on that. There's also guidance coming out of Europe where the data processing authority, or I'm sorry, the data protection authorities have very clearly issued guidance saying, we get COVID, we get coronavirus, we get that there's a need to share this information. All of this stuff that we're doing very much still applies. And so companies, I'm talking with companies on a daily basis about, hey, we want to enact temperature monitoring at our company, for example. All of those things still are subject to these laws. And in my experience, most of our client base just wasn't to the point where they needed to be able to handle those efficiently beforehand. Now you add urgency, you add people trying to do this on a quick way. It's really a mess right now.
Good. That's a good segue. Jared, are you seeing your customers starting to branch out into new areas? Like, I mean, you've talked about some of the service that you offer, like, traditional pen testing, fuzzing, stuff like that. But are you seeing that when you're getting in and you're establishing new relationships with these customers and educating them, so to speak, are they starting to say, well, what about this or what about that?
Yeah, I think to an extent, it's a good question and a good point. A lot of it depends on any organization's maturity. Even the things you guys were just talking about, some of the practices and policies around handling, important data from a privacy standpoint and stuff. A lot of times organizations with a lesser maturity just won't be set up as well to deal with that, right? And so a lot of this comes with organizational maturity as you kind of grow into these. And we see that in particular in many of the domains where we help people. You could think about it from an enterprise security. It's the same with an AppSec side, right? You might have a company that maybe they had an idea, they started writing some code, things are moving along, they've got a few developers full-time now, and they suddenly realize, boy, we really need to think about this from a GDPR standpoint, or from a HIPAA, or from a PCI, or even from a cybersecurity. Maybe we haven't done everything we could. So they'll come out and engage with us and get a code audit, and then we'll find a bunch of vulnerabilities, and that'll be great. And they'll be like, wow, that was really great. You helped us find a lot of things that if, had gotten out would have been really bad. What should we have done in the first place? Like, how should we have built this software to begin with? And so then they'll start, kind of, let's get back to the SDLC background, go back to the drawing board and think about, could we be doing this faster on an ongoing basis with CI/CD? Could we be, putting all this stuff in the cloud in some way if we're not already, or could we be, having some kind of automated security scans from a static and dynamic standpoint instead of just doing peer reviews and manual audits? They start beginning to look at what's the security journey look like rather than just a point in time check. All of those are important, and we can help, anybody at any place. The important point is to starting anywhere is better than not starting, nowhere, basically. So that's one change that we do see, is that as companies mature, that's just one example as it relates to privacy or security. So I guess I'll stop there, but I do have some other thoughts around some of the other things that we are seeing throughout this whole, pandemic situation. We are seeing some other types of changes as well.
Yeah, let me get to
Aaron.
Sure.
I wanted to jump in there too, if you don't mind. And this goes to Jared and Dan, and then follows up with Brian. But Dan, you mentioned the idea of don't get into something without knowing how you're going to get out of something, right? And I look at a lot of conversations I have with companies and projects they're working on. Some of those projects are put on hold because they don't know how to get out of this, and they need to work on that first before they can do this. And the whole project timeline is based on how to get out of some of the things that they're in, right? And it creates issues. Mm-hmm. And then you look at where we're at today, and if you go to the east side of Michigan, there's still OEMs that are telling their supply base they still have to cut 5% in APR, and they want 20% overall on a cost-cutting measure. Good and point. Top management all the way down just says you need to cut costs. So the people that are working on these projects don't always have access directly to the CFO, but if they really don't understand that all your budgets are going to be cut, and these people up here really don't understand the whole security and privacy, because even the people working don't understand what they were getting into, how things have changed and gradually and really changed, but the speed at which attacks are happening now too. I'm seeing this carrying out over the last month and a half, where hey, we're just going to stick with our legacy AV. It's the cheapest thing we can find. But did you know that the OE is probably going to have a rule or some type of requirement coming out in the future? And it's not just that you have to have an insurance policy, right? Like, anyways, I'm throwing that out as more fodder for the fire.
Yeah, I think that, so, and what you just described is actually, as Jared was speaking, it's something that I keep, it's the battle between SDLC and MVP in the startup layer. What's more important to put our resources in? Getting a product out the door, doing it securely out the door, securely from the start. This costs a lot more, it takes a lot longer, and we have a great, so this all comes back to risk management, and it's the same discussion, in the OEMs and at the larger institutions, where I think this is the point in time where bringing those security, privacy, and other challenges into the risk mindset. And you mentioned the CFO. The CFO is a great place to do that, because now you're slotting security risks are now business risks. And more people are seeing it. Wow, it was great just to watch all the heads nod. Security risks are business risks. And so using the CFO and changing out of concrete statements, this will happen, this will not happen, but turning them into risk assessment, risk mindset, and speaking the languages of the CFO and the people who talk in risk, on credit risk, brand risk, treasury risk, FX risk, all of those other areas. We can now bring privacy and security into the discussion and get the same seat at the table to have these alongside. If we don't deliver this physical product, or we cut this, it now allows and enables these topics to come into that same discussion. And then you pick the ones that are most important. Just like we complain about SMS as a 2FA mechanism, it's insecure, it shouldn't be used, but is it better than nothing? Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I can speak.
Did you say Smurfly?
I did.
That was sorry.
I think you make a great point in terms of the C-suite and their considerations here. I mean, this is absolutely on every CFO's radar. This is absolutely on every general counsel's radar. You guys can have these conversations in a way that you weren't able to before, but you don't have it on I need this new tool. It's on this is what we need to do to manage risk better as this organization. In terms of, how do we exit these contracts? It's really easy to exit a contract if you put those provisions in the agreement ahead of time, right? And it says, give me 30 days notice and you're out of this. Great. Well, if I'm taking a look at that contract and it's got you locked in for a 2-year term, and after that, you got to give them 180 days to get out of it. Hell no, we're not agreeing to those, right? So doing that on the front end proactively and looking at part of that and getting those provisions in make it really easy. But something else that you need to be doing at most organizations, just a bit of a tip. Most organizations I work with aren't great at this process overall. You're always working off of somebody else's paper, whatever they send over. Here, legal, look at this really quick. We got to sign it tomorrow. Whatever they say is what we're going to take. You have options and choices in a way that you didn't before. And one of the sort of tricks that I like to employ a lot and something that you all can do is effectively trying to hang sort of an addendum onto their contract. If you can't get them onto your contract, take their contract and let's put a data security addendum or something like that on the back of it that says, in order to work with us, here's the things that we require you to meet. Now, I'm not going to go out and ask them for a lot of things that they shouldn't already be doing. In fact, it's going to be effectively a listing of best practices or a listing of things that these laws require them to do. What that does is a couple things. One, it allows you to navigate their sort of internal contracting process. I'm able to get a lot more changes done to a contract if I'm working off an addendum that I added than to their standardized language, because most of the people you're working with are afraid to change anything and need permissions and blah, blah, blah. And two, it opens the door to vet that company and have a conversation with them about, well, tell me why you're not meeting this standards. Tell me why you're not willing to provide encryption for this data. Tell me why you don't think you're a service provider under California Consumer Privacy Act. And you have that conversation with them at the front end and get those things written in ahead of time. If they're not going to work with you, you're out. And to Daniel's point about startups and those kinds of things and MVPs, we're on both sides of these deals, right? And I have a number of clients that are very small tech companies. They will sign what you tell them to sign in order to get your business. And if they get hacked, they're screwed and the company's out of business anyway, so we'll worry about that later. So having that opportunity to vet those companies, work with them through that, have a conversation that says, we think these are best practices. You got to tell me why you're not going to meet those before I work with you. And if they're not going to work with you, if they're going to be squirrely about it, go on to somebody else. You have options.
But on the flip side, on the VC and PE side, there is value in looking at companies that are security and privacy ready. Material value to the bottom line, to the valuation of the company.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that kind of goes in with what I was going to say to your original question about Brian, about, who's doing what when these budgets get cut and when that type of stuff happens. Unfortunately, anytime there is a major event or a disaster, or there's something going on in the world, at first people generally come together and work together, which is awesome. We still see a lot of great things just on a personal side taking place, which is amazing. Neighbors looking after neighbors and really good things. But you'll always eventually get, right, attackers or even politicians or whatever. They'll start fighting and kind of try to leverage the event in one form or another to try to kind of swing things their way, right? And we definitely see attackers doing that. We've helped with some incident response lately. There's been a little bit of an uptick on those, right? Kind of hacks and scams and ransomwares and things associated with everything that's going on, and kind of hitting people when they're down and when they're sort of least ready for this. And so, as budgets get cut, and if companies haven't prepared, there is a situation there waiting for them. And unfortunately, some of them do have to kind of, they just have to learn the hard way, right? They kind of have the minds. There's still some out there that, we haven't had a problem yet. We haven't been hacked yet. So,
And
but
the
when
sand, ostrich companies.
Yeah,
No.
we definitely, and they
We're
do
not
pay
a
more,
target.
they
We're
end
allowed
up
to see
spending
them.
more on the back end. It costs them more. They're surprised by the cost of what it takes to clean up and deal with all that, and hire all the right legal fees and companies and everybody else to come in and kind of clean up the mess. And it was a whole rebuild of the last network that we dealt with. It was the ransomware authors got in and nuked everything, including the backups, because they got AD and everything like that. So they just destroyed this place from top to bottom. So it's a problem. Last thing I'll say, just on the other thing that you guys were talking about, I'll just say one quick thing on the conversation around contractual things that you were just discussing. It's interesting to hear you talk about it, because I don't know who all's on this call and who's listening. Certainly there's some technical people, and this kind of work isn't in our field often considered the sexiest work, right? If they're a security architect or hacker or whatever, they want to be auditing the AWS buckets or hacking the software or whatever it may be, kind of, is considered in some cases, and I don't know I don't really believe that's true, but it can be considered sexier work. But the upfront work, the business work, the legal work, the contractual work, that stuff is every bit as important. And because some security folks aren't as interested in that work, I think there ends up being more of a vacuum on that side. You end up with business leaders and CFOs and CEOs and people that really have no business making security decisions, making those decisions, because there's no security people around that want to deal with those things. And that's an interesting thing that we see a lot in this field. So I was happy to have us having those conversations.
Yeah, a little bit of career advice from my perspective. I work with many more in the C-suite outside the technical area than inside the technical area. If you can combine the skills that you all have with the ability to talk that business side, you're going to set yourself apart from a lot of your colleagues.
Business bilingual.
So certainly being able to talk to the compliance and the risk management side of it, you're going to get the ear of a lot of CFOs and CEOs, I think.
Yeah, the technology we use is becoming more utility, where business finds the value is in being able to answer the so what. We need to patch these vulnerabilities. Exactly. So what? What does it mean?
And the laws are catching up with that. So it used to be, so what? Well, this theoretically might happen someday down the road. And now it's like, no, this law specifically says you're going to be responsible for this dollar amount, 4% of your annual global revenue at the maximum end in the case of the GDPR, right? And by the way, some of these new laws that are coming out are proposing like CEOs go to jail if they have like egregious failures to take care of this, et cetera, et cetera. That conversation is advanced. Not to mention the breach risk side. These guys read the papers just like all their buddies do. They don't want to be the guy who wasn't prepared for that breach and get the massive clean out event that really hits them. And so there's definitely some competition there that's driving a lot of business that just a straight up cybersecurity for cybersecurity's sake conversation wouldn't get you in the past.
We have a pause for a quick question.
Hey guys.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, caller.
A long time first time.
Yeah. Don't want to cut into your business or anything like that, but wanted to see if you can answer this. Especially with now everybody being remote and whatnot, the chances of your C-suite or whatever you want to call it coming to you for an advice or even considering security in their decision-making process is going to be, I don't know, not high, I guess. So consulting with your security person is not going to be high on their priority, at least in my opinion. Or let's put it this way: nobody called me when COVID hit. So what are your suggestions to to your security colleagues? I mean, do we spam our executives? What do you guys suggest for us to do?
Oh, are you saying you want to be able to directly ask them what is your game plan? What are you doing to mitigate risk?
No. I mean, what
to get the seat at that table and to have those conversations.
Yeah. What do you suggest I do as a security professional to help out my executives in my company to be aware of, hey, we do have technical things to worry about with everybody working remote. It's not just all, everybody's just happy-go-lucky going home and working remotely, VPNing in, and everything is normal as it can be. And there still is our bad guys out there, trying to break in and take us for a ride and stuff like that. So, like I said, in any help starting that conversation, or maybe continuing that conversation with addition of the current situation in hand, I guess.
I'll just take the first 2 seconds on that and then let anyone else jump in on it. But, it is a bilateral conversation, right? I mean, so I think as security people, we do have to understand that there is a business and they do have to make payroll, and, the business, if the business goes away, then there's nothing left to secure. And that there's some truth to that. I think so. We do have to keep that in mind. So I think, understanding their perspective is helpful, and then helping them understand your perspective is helpful too. I guess I would just say be proactive. Just reach out to those business leaders and say, hey, I really care about our business. I know you've had your hands full just making sure that people get paid and all the basic things around the business, but I've got these 4 following security concerns that I think that we should talk about, because maybe we're doing great over on these 3 areas, but we have this one area where I really think we have a gap. And that's just kind of like, I guess, consulting and organizational maturity, how you approach people, how you talk to people, letting them understand that you see both sides of the coin. I think goes a long way to kind of having the soft skills to navigate those waters.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. And being able to frame it in business terms, if you can take and translate it into what does this mean? If we have this issue, what does it mean? We'll get you a long way. And then the other, take some change management principles, not technology change management, but organizational change management. Find some people, if you're not comfortable going directly to a CISO or CIO or CEO or CFO, find somebody who is trusted by that person and have them help bridge the discussion. And then long term, the relationships you have before an incident will be the best benefit to you during the incident. So building relationships, building open discussion, making security feel like it's not a closed box or magic or secret squirrel, so that everybody wants to come and ask questions. At all ranges of question will set you up for a good future when they need, and then they'll come and ask for advice more proactively, because they feel like they're going to get they're not going to get chastised for asking, but they're also going to get some business informed answers.
Just wanted to say I'm nodding, and thank you, by the way.
I think historically, for people who business leaders who already understand this stuff, they get those risks, and I think they're probably already taking action. It sounds to me like you're talking more about business leaders who maybe historically haven't put the focus on this cybersecurity type issues in the way that they should. And I think what resonates with them is the immediate risk of breach. And so, historically, the sort of non-technical CEO would go to Bob, the IT guy, to use Martin's example from earlier, and say, "Are we good?" Bob be like, "Yep, we're good." Be like, "All right, we're good." And that was it, right? That was the conversation. And I think that's no longer going to work. But having some, I guess, vulnerability or willingness to go to the CEO. Long story short, here's what I would do. I would go to the executives and I would say, we are vulnerable to a cyber attack, a ransomware attack, however you want to phrase it, right now. more than we were yesterday because of COVID-19. Here's what could happen. Here's what ransomware would look like for this company. Here's what some kind of a breach would look like in terms of our financial responsibility or reporting obligations. I need the ability to take more action than I'm currently taking right now to avoid that situation. Will you help me get there? And just be really direct with them in terms of there are vulnerabilities. You can't go to them and say, everything's great, we just need a little bit more. They're not going to be responsive to that. It needs to be, this is a immediate risk that is only made worse by this coronavirus situation because we're seeing a bunch more attacks. Here's what that looks like for your company. Do you want to do something about that while we still can? Yes or no?
I just wanted to add on to what Daniel and Brian were saying. I've seen a lot of success too. If you go to the business and ask for an audit, let them know that the landscape has changed in your IT department, and now you need some kind of audit or risk assessment and reassess where you're at. And that's often a lot easier to bridge with that conversation and get that started. And then you've got something on paper from a security consulting firm somewhere that says, here's all the problems you've got, and here's what those could potentially mean. But asking for a risk assessment is a lot easier than diving straight into the security. Sometimes if you've got a C-level that's not engaged in the security conversation well enough yet, the risk assessment's a great place to start.
Well, because you're speaking in terms the business can understand. No, very good point. Thank you. All right, we've got about 12 minutes left.
I had a quick question. This is Bill.
Sure, go ahead.
Thanks. Great topic today. So this is a little bit, I've been reading a little bit about sort of a future state, right? In whether it's manufacturing, retail. And one of the ideas that's coming up a little bit is the idea of, will enterprises be able to collect things like, thermal imaging, temperatures on people? And does that relate to privacy biometrics in laws like Texas and Washington State and Illinois, Florida? Have you guys got any thoughts on that? Kind of a future state will collect, people that normally wouldn't have collected biometrics on their either employees or customers, and where that might lead. It's a little futuristic, but just thinking out loud here.
I'm sure some of these guys have much more detailed thoughts than I do on that one. The only thing I wanted to say on that, I have been thinking about that and seeing, I'm sure we've all been seeing this when it comes to privacy and, and not to sound at all political, because that's not where I mean to go with it, but just anytime there's emergency powers that get taken up, whether it's in a business or in a state or a federal or any kind of level, and all of a sudden, changes can be made without debate, without a chance for people to weigh in, without a chance for there to be a security analysis or a privacy study. Or I do worry about that. I think that the cure can definitely become worse than the threat in many cases if we just start swinging at everything that comes out without putting it to the smart folks that ought to be thinking and working on that. So that's the only thing.
I mean, like the smartphone tracking that's been happening that no one opted in on,
right? Yeah, it's
for 20 years.
Well, that too, but
isn't that coming? Isn't that coming? I mean, a lot of stuff I'm reading about that, the differences between the geo tracking, contact tracking, and folks that are like Apple and Google, who are really putting out there to the consumers what it is they're doing and why, and how they're solving for it, with this whole content tracking thing, with the beacons and the platforms working together, what they're solving for. So as they're moving towards that each responsible party is putting those opt-in things into their technology, right? I mean, as long as the third party is upfront with the consumer about what the information is being shared, consumers will most likely want to opt in during this time, but I want a way out. After pandemic goes down, I want a way out. I want to contribute to the good of the community, but tell me the way out. And I think with Beacon, or with the Beacon technology and the content tracking that Google and Apple have partnered on, I think is really a great way to go. It minimizes that the location stuff, the privacy stuff, the things I worry about. But everyone's like a little different when it comes to privacy. I would be more than willing to share my information if I knew what it was you were going to get and how I can get it back.
And that's exactly where the laws are heading. Yeah, that's exactly where the laws are trying to push it right now, Ralph. And Phil, thanks for your question. The only thing I would disagree with Phil on is this isn't a future problem. I most recently dealt with this exact problem of taking people's temperatures this morning before this call. This is here. This is right now today. And we're having this dialogue of how much of my personal privacy am I willing to give away in exchange for, theoretical things about sort of societal health and safety and all those kinds of things. Very important issues, very important conversations. These are sort of developments of, remember the California terrorist incident from a few years ago, and the FBI is trying to get into the phone. Which was a continuation of Ed Snowden conversations, et cetera. This is right here, right now in front of us. And so what has not changed is companies' abilities to collect information about people. You can still basically do all of the things it used to be doing. What has changed and what the laws are bringing about, and what increasingly will continue to change now and into those future laws, is the way in which you are able to do that legally. And so it is all about pushing exactly what Ralph was talking about. The decision, the notice, and the ability to make a genuine choice, genuine consent to the front of the collection process. You see Zoom getting in trouble right now. You see, I can't remember the name of it. Another sort of similar app got in trouble because as soon as you fire these things up, all your data goes off to Facebook and good luck ever getting it back. The laws are coming in and saying, you cannot do that. These companies are going to get sued and going to get hammered for those kinds of activities. You must give individuals a choice at the point of collection. And that choice must be a genuine choice that you are then allowed to legitimately take it back after the fact if you choose to do that. And so, it's about, not about changing what we can collect. It's about the way that you can do it. And those conversations are happening now. Any new law that comes out anywhere around the world that is considering privacy is putting that in as one of the core things. And I think you're seeing people increasingly become aware of these things. If Zoom came out 20 years ago or whatever, when Facebook came out, it would have been 20 years before people figured out potential privacy issues with it. And now you see the
they wouldn't have been watching the traffic.
Didn't use Zoom. It gets completely adopted, and then 3 days after everybody's talking about how great Zoom is, now all the privacy stuff has started for them. So those cycles are definitely shortening. People are paying attention to this stuff in a way they didn't, even a couple years ago.
Yeah, giving people technical controls, imagine if there was a physical switch on your phone that would be, like a privacy switch, almost like there's a mute button or, some way to turn your Alexa off, like a hard line, like a hard switch or something. I think maybe not everybody wants that, but certainly I think there's enough people out there that wish there was a way to say, hey, I'm putting my stuff in privacy mode, or, I could switch something on and take that back to your point, or change something that's allowing me to opt in or out on kind of a real-time basis. I think that would be cool.
Yeah. So here's what gets interesting. I've heard, just real quick, I've heard on those apps, they need 60% adoption of all these contact tracing apps for them to be worth anything. And so if we get to the point where at 40% adoption, what happens then? What arguments get made? What pressures are put on people to say, okay, well, if everybody's not going to do this the right way, then here we come, like other governments around the world have already done, and we're going to make you adopt these things. Those would be interesting issues to deal with.
So two things. One, just to come back to the original question, temperature collection and other things are, in Michigan at least, are generally covered under employment law because there's no healthcare provider involved. And so it is distinct from HIPAA. So it's different protections, but talk to your attorney about what you can and can't collect and how you need to protect it. But it is not in the state of Michigan. Well, it's not under HIPAA because there's no healthcare provider, but handle it, speak with your attorneys about that accordingly. But I think this all points to a discussion we've been having in one of my previous roles. I had opportunity to work with some of the most phenomenal user experience people ever. And regularly we came to the discussion that security and privacy have a UX problem. If you remember Windows Vista, Apple, or iOS 13, the agree. If you're a Doctor Who fan this season, there was a whole bit about we've generated you to just click accept. And this is something that, back to Brian's point, you have to give people meaningful choice, but you can't use trickery to get them to click it. You can't use, and you have to keep them engaged in the discussion long enough. So I know that there's a good technical group here. This is a great challenge for us as technologists to bring this to our businesses to say, here are ways we can keep people engaged in this discussion through technology. Because right now we've lost them. My son jokes about, I'll just click accept everything. But he's 12 and he likes to rib me about everything. Yep. Yeah, exactly. And he knows what I do. So, but the UX problem, I think, is a real one, especially as you start to balance the greater good versus personal privacy.
Okay, great point.
We got a couple more minutes. I wanted quickly ask one more question, and then we may have to have a follow-up meeting on
Great
this.
conversation. This could go on for
yes.
hours.
Some of us have day jobs that we have to be mindful for. I would love to be able to just do this all day. All right, one last question with last couple minutes.
He threw that shot at me, by the way. I know where that was going.
So while everyone is in the same boat with increased working remote and teaching, we see learning institutions seem to have like a harder road ahead. So like for Daniel and Brian, how do you see learning institutions blending those new challenges of trying to maintain security, doing remote education, and still being mindful of privacy, because there's also student privacy laws, right?
Mm-hmm. And there's ethics that go beyond the laws too. And higher ed is higher ed, and yes, I'll separate K-12 and higher ed. I have a student in K-12, and I have and I'm in a higher ed institution. But I think higher ed generally believes about privacy in a way that I think even goes beyond what the laws require. They do really believe that students and people have rights, significant rights to privacy. But I think at the same time, I come back to the risk management discussion. It's about how do we balance these three things. I don't know if there are any project managers in the room, but I'm sure we've all heard from our project managers, you can have it fast, cheap, or good. It's this everything comes back to a triangle for me. It's this triangle, and I can pull on one and I lose the others. And I think it's the same case here, where you have to make some value discussions about each one and say, all right, do I want this? How much can I pull on security, and where is the right middle point on privacy, and where's the right middle point on utility, and enabling classrooms? And maybe you make some different decisions. Centralization and consistency is all fine and good, but you may have different cases. So at Michigan State, we've taken Zoom. The Zoom discussion is easier for us because we've taken and allowed students to participate on them in classes. The administrative work is happening in Microsoft Teams for chat and video. So we've been able to segment out some of these things, and using inconsistency in technology help put the risks in better places.
Excellent. Hey, Matt, I do have to drop off, and for everybody on the call, thank you guys very much. And we may have to have a follow-up session.
Thank you, Aaron.
Well, thank you, Aaron, for asking.
Well, and with that, I know other people will probably as well, so we can go ahead and wrap up here, unless, Brian, I don't know if you had anything to quickly add to that last point before we...
No, that's okay. We can go ahead and wrap. I know we're
okay.
at time.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, panelists, this was awesome conversation. Appreciate all of you, volunteering your time to jump on and do this. I think we could all keep this conversation going forever, like it's been said, because this is really relevant topics. Again, from a CSA standpoint, thank you to everyone that came today. Sentinel One and Stealthbits, a huge thank you to you guys. You're two companies that are making a huge difference today in the lives of a lot of our frontline workers. Again, support the technology companies that are supporting our community. I will preach that until people shut me up, which has not happened in 47 years. So good luck with that, because I think that's really critical. So anyways, thanks again. 2 weeks we'll be doing this again, and we've got more great stuff planned. So with that, everyone have a great rest of your afternoon, and thank you very much.
Thanks, all.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you.
a great day.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Jared.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Brian.